Have you tried not coloring your scene dies? Well, that's what we're doing today with this scene card from Cottage Cuts. I am going to be using my background die, which is a scene of a farm, and I'm going to be adding pops of color that will also help highlight my sentiment. This scene die was created to use by itself on the background, but we're going to make some adjustments and use it with other Cottage Cuts elements. Here's a look at the 3 dies that I'll be using. The first one is Kitty with Daisies. There is a kitty cat, 2 different faces that you can use on this, and 2 different daisies. I also have the fresh strawberry patch, and then I'll be using this fall farm scene die. And as you can see, it is a barn and there are some apples in a basket. It's the perfect placement for my kitty, and then of course from the fresh strawberry patch, I'll be using the bee, the butterfly, the flowers, and the strawberries. Let's jump right in. So I've die cut a piece of cardstock, white cardstock, and I've kept all of the negative pieces except for the apples which fell out that I wasn't too concerned about in the die cut, and I'm going to add a piece of white cardstock over the back of it after I add my glue. I'll use my Spellbinder's Tool-in-One to loosen any of the pieces that are in those negative spaces, and then I'm going to strategically do some cutting. So I was careful when I was gluing the background with the wet glue. It's important that you use wet glue with this because I really don't think it would be as easy if you used a tape runner on this. I left the wet glue off where the apples are in the barrel. I left it off the top of that barrel because I'm going to remove these apples with my scissors. So this is super easy to do. It's not hard at all. As long as it's not glued down, you're going to be able to cut around it. I know the scale of my strawberries. They're going to fit and cover up any imperfections that I might have. Now I want this one layer, and you're going to see that it's kind of flat in the background because I did leave all of the negative pieces in. I added that larger piece of cardstock to the back because I never get anything straight, and I wanted to make sure that if I got it crooked, all I needed to do was trim off any of that excess cardstock, which is what I'm doing. So this die has a little bit of a border, and I'm able to use that as a guide to do my trimming. I'm going to set that aside, and we're going to move on to some Copic coloring. Now I've cut my cat out using Copic Express It paper. As I mentioned, there are 2 different style of faces. There's one with the cat's eyes closed, one with it open, and then there are 2 different daisies, one that's a little more contemporary, the other a little bit more traditional. So for my Copic coloring, I wanted to add a little bit of like patches or pattern onto the cat. So I drew the W5 down to the eye. You can see on the left hand side that I've added that darker color. I blended it out with the W3, and then I've completed that with the W1, and then of course I went over it twice because I always go over my images twice when I do my Copic coloring. For the body, I added that patchiness to the toes. I added a little bit to the tip of the tail, so there's 2 different areas in the toes where they're a little bit darker, and then of course I added my shadows where the legs are meeting the chest and then where the back legs meet the front legs, and that's just going to give this a little bit of dimension. I like to go over the outside with any of the 3 colors that I used just to make sure that I don't have that white edge. To add some color to the ears, I used an R2, and then I'll do the same thing with the nose. I'll add the nose to the image, and then I'm going to bring in my fine line Copic marker. This die beautifully embosses the whiskers, the eyes, and the little upper part of the mouth, I guess. the muzzle maybe is what you would call it. And I'm going to use that Copic marker just to accentuate where those whiskers are. I'll add my head to my cat, making it a little bit askew to give it some character. And once I dry fit the daisies, I'm going to choose, as I mentioned, the more traditional of the two. That will complete my cat. Moving on to our card panel. So now we're going to start building our card. This paper that I have here is ultra thin, so I was not able to use wet glue with it. It was important that I used a tape runner because it would have left bumps underneath this cardstock. So I have an A2 panel, which is top folding, and I'm very carefully adding my plaid border. This die cut measures 3 1/4 by 4 1/4 inches, no, 3 1/2 by 4 1/2 inches, and I've added a red card panel behind it. I left about 1/8 of an inch border on both sides, and now you're going to see where this card starts to pop. So as I mentioned, you look at that background and it's really blending in to the rest of the card, even with the pops of color as I'm adding these strawberries inside the basket. Again, I'm just tucking them in where I didn't glue them in the barrel. You're going to see right here when I add this die cut, I've removed all of the negative pieces, and this is what's going to give this white background a pop. It's going to add interest to the card. It's going to really step up the game of this card. You could add 2 layers of this cardstock, this die cut piece over the top, and that would make it pop even more. But look at the change just by adding that second panel of negative pieces, of the positive pieces, I'm sorry. Now, I would like to mention right here that this would be another great way if you wanted to die cut the back of the panel and you like the sky and everything else. By adding this colored layer, if you colored the top layer on top, it would hide any imperfections that you would have in your coloring. So if you wanted to use this same concept by adding your other die cut images to the scene, then you certainly could color it. But again, my sentiment is going to read, "You are my sunshine." I do stamp it off camera, and I thought that leaving it white and adding the pop of color would really be cohesive with the sentiment, because you can see that, you know, the background is dull being white, and then the little kitty cat and all the elements are just the brightness to the card. The cat is scaled, as you can see, perfectly for this scene. The barn is very much in the background once I add that cat to the front, so the barn no longer becomes the focal point on this panel. I'm going to glue all of my pieces down, and once I finish with these flowers, I'm looking at the card and I'm thinking, you know, my sentiment reads, "You are my sunshine." Shouldn't my sunshine be colored? So I have a lot of color at the bottom of the card, more towards the middle, but I have nothing at the top. I will bring in a yellow Copic marker. I could have done this I could have done this before I added my panel down, but again, hindsight's 20/20. So once I glue this panel down, which I'm leaving a nice border at the bottom, so you see that I added it more towards the top center than to the main center of the card, and that's so I have a place for my sentiment. But as I mentioned, I am going to add that pop of color, and you're going to see that it really does change the look of the card. It's funny how little things that you do really can change the character of things. So adding that bit of yellow to the sun made a big difference. Once I get this glued down, I'm going to do one of my favorite things, and that is add a little bit of detail with my gel pen. I think the gel pen really does help add those additional pops of interest to the card. I'll add some to the strawberries and to the kitties. I'll add it to the sun rays. I'll add a bit of color with that R2 to the cheeks. and that's going to complete my card for today. So I want to thank you so much for joining me. I hope this gave you an idea of ways that you can use your background dies in different ways to create different looks. You don't always have to color everything. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to give it a big thumbs up. And until next time, I hope you have a fabulous day. Thanks so much for watching.